The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth of what used to be Thomas Hartwell's soybean field, now nothing more than a patchwork of dust and broken dreams. He stood at the edge of his property, weathered hands gripping a foreclosure notice that had arrived with the dawn, the paper trembling not from the October breeze, but from the rage building in his chest like steam in a kettle. 53 years old, and this was what he had to show for a lifetime of back-breaking work, debt that towered higher than his barn, and a reputation in Millbrook County that had become synonymous with failure. "Another brilliant business decision by our local genius," came the mocking voice of Dale Pritchard from behind him. Thomas didn't need to turn around to know that Dale's pickup truck was idling on the county road, probably with half the coffee shop crowd crammed into the cab, all eager for their morning entertainment at his expense. "What's next, Tommy? Going to buy some oceanfront property in Kansas?" If this story of one man's desperate gamble is already pulling you in, it only takes a second to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. The laughter that followed felt like salt in an open wound. Thomas had grown accustomed to it over the years. The snickers at the hardware store, the whispered conversations that stopped when he walked into Miller's diner. The way people's eyes would dance with amusement whenever his name came up in conversation. He had become Millbrook's favorite cautionary tale, the man who couldn't seem to make a right decision if his life depended on it. And maybe it did. The foreclosure notice crinkled as his grip tightened. 60 days. That's all the time the bank was giving him to come up with $47,000 in back payments, plus interest, plus penalties that seemed to multiply like rabbits in spring. 3 generations of family legacy would be erased, sold to some corporation that would probably tear down the century-old farmhouse and plant the kind of genetically modified crops that his grandfather would have called an abomination. "You still out there communing with your dirt, Hartwell?" Dale's voice carried the particular brand of cruelty that only came from small-town familiarity. "Maybe if you talk to your crops as much as you talk to that mud, you might actually grow something worth selling." Thomas finally turned, his steel-gray eyes meeting Dale's smug grin through the windshield. Dale's inherited wealth and questionable business practices had made him the county's most successful and most resented operator. He had been making Thomas's life miserable since high school, and success had only sharpened his appetite for humiliation. "Morning, Dale," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion that came from fighting a losing battle for too long. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The simplicity of his response seemed to frustrate Dale, who had clearly been hoping for more of a reaction. "Won't be so beautiful when the bank trucks show up to haul away everything you own. But hey, look on the bright side. Maybe whoever buys this place will actually know what to do with good farmland." The truck's engine revved, and he caught a glimpse of other faces in the cab. Jimmy Morrison from the feed store, Pete Vandenberg, who ran the grain elevator, all of them wearing expressions of mingled amusement and schadenfreude. Former teammates and childhood friends now wore expressions of mingled amusement and schadenfreude. As the truck disappeared in a cloud of dust, Thomas looked down at the foreclosure notice again. The legal language blurred together, but the numbers remained crystal clear. $47,000 might as well have been $47 million. His checking account held $312. His savings account had been emptied months ago. The last of his equipment had been sold to keep the lights on through the summer. He walked slowly back toward the farmhouse, each step stirring up small clouds of dust that seemed to mock his grandfather's memory. The old man would have found a way out of this mess. Samuel Hartwell had survived the Great Depression, drought years, floods, and every challenge that farming could throw at a man. He had built this place from a single mortgage and a dream, turning rocky soil into fertile ground through sheer determination and an almost mystical understanding of the land. But Thomas wasn't his grandfather. Every decision he had made seemed designed to prove that point. A series of costly missteps had drained his resources: organic certification, failed specialty crops, and a fraudulent distributor, and left nothing behind but worthless contracts and empty promises. The screen door of the farmhouse creaked as he stepped onto the porch, a sound that had once meant coming home, but now felt like entering a mausoleum. Inside, the silence was deafening. His wife, Margaret, had left 6 months ago, taking their daughter Sarah and what remained of her patience. She hadn't been cruel about it, hadn't screamed or thrown things. She had simply sat at the kitchen table one morning and said, "I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore, Thomas, and I won't let you destroy Sarah, too." He had wanted to argue, to tell her that everything he was doing was for them, for their future, for the legacy he wanted to leave behind. But the words had died in his throat, because they both knew the truth. He wasn't fighting for them anymore. He was fighting against the idea of giving up, against admitting that maybe everyone was right. Maybe he was just a failure who couldn't see the writing on the wall. The kitchen table, where Margaret had delivered her ultimatum, was now covered with unpaid bills, legal notices, and newspaper clippings he had been collecting about other farmers who had lost their land. He had been looking for patterns, for some common thread that might help him understand where he had gone wrong. But all he found were variations on the same theme: good people destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, dreams crushed under the weight of debt and market forces that cared nothing for individual suffering. Thomas poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the warmer since yesterday, the liquid now thick enough to stand a spoon in. As he sat down at the table, his eyes fell on a newspaper clipping he had almost forgotten about. A small item from the County Historical Society newsletter about unusual land formations in the area. Most of it was the kind of dry, academic language that put people to sleep. But one paragraph had caught his attention weeks ago. The marshy lowlands south of Millbrook were once part of an extensive wetland system that connected to the Ohio River via underground streams. Historical accounts from early settlers described unusual depressions in the landscape that were avoided by both Native Americans and pioneers. Local folklore suggests these areas were considered cursed, though geological surveys indicate they may have been formed by underground waterways that have since changed course. He had filed it away as interesting but useless information, the kind of historical trivia that might make for good conversation but had no practical application to his current crisis. But now, staring at foreclosure, he found his mind returning to those unusual depressions and underground waterways. There was something about the description that nagged at him, some connection he couldn't quite make. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed the bank's number, and Thomas let it go to the answering machine. He had nothing new to tell them, no miraculous solution to offer. The machine clicked on, and Amanda Sterling's professionally sympathetic voice filled the kitchen. "Thomas, this is Amanda from First National. I know this is a difficult time, but we really need to discuss your options. The foreclosure proceedings are moving forward, but if you can demonstrate a concrete plan for addressing the arrearage, we might be able to work something out. Please call me as soon as possible." Options.
The word felt like a joke. Thomas had explored every option he could think of. He had applied for emergency agricultural loans and been turned down. He had reached out to distant relatives who might have been willing to help and discovered that his reputation for poor financial decisions had spread far beyond Millbrook County. He had even swallowed his pride and approached Dale Pritchard about buying the farm, only to be offered a price so insulting that walking away had been the only response that preserved what little dignity he had left. But as he sat there in the gathering silence, that newspaper clipping seemed to pulse with possibility. Unusual depressions, underground waterways, land that both Native Americans and pioneers had avoided. What if their avoidance hadn't been based on superstition? What if there had been a practical reason to stay away from those areas?
Thomas stood up and walked to the window that looked out over his failed fields toward the marshy lowlands that bordered his property. He had always considered that swampy ground to be worthless, too wet for farming, too unstable for development, good for nothing but mosquitoes and the occasional hunting blind during duck season. But what if he had been looking at it all wrong? The idea that began to form in his mind was so crazy that he almost laughed out loud. But desperation had a way of making the impossible seem merely improbable, and improbable was better than the certain destruction that waited for him in 60 days. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his steps quicker than they had been in months. If he was going to go down, he might as well go down swinging. And if people thought he was crazy before, they were about to get a demonstration of just how far a desperate man could push the boundaries of reasonable behavior. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist that clung to the lowlands like a shroud. Thomas Hartwell walked toward his date with either salvation or the final confirmation of his reputation as Millbrook County's greatest fool. At this point, he wasn't sure there was much difference between the two. But for the first time in months, he felt something other than despair churning in his chest. It might have been hope, or it might have been madness. Time would tell which one it was. Thomas spent the next 3 days walking the perimeter of the Blackwater Marsh, a 50-acre tract of seemingly worthless swampland that sat like a festering wound on the southeastern edge of Millbrook County. The property had been on the market for over 2 years, its price dropping every few months like a stone falling through dark water. What had started as a $75,000 asking price had gradually descended to $35,000. Then $28,000, and now sat at a desperate $22,000. Still far more money than Thomas had, but somehow within the realm of possibility if he was willing to mortgage what little remained of his soul. The real estate agent, a perpetually optimistic woman named Linda Chen, who seemed to specialize in impossible sales, had been calling him twice a day since he had made his initial inquiry. She spoke about the property with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for oceanfront mansions, describing it as a unique opportunity for someone with vision and prime development potential once proper drainage solutions are implemented. What she didn't mention, but what everyone in the county knew, was that 3 previous buyers had tried and failed to develop the land, each losing substantial amounts of money before walking away in defeat. The marsh stretched out before him like a green-black mirror, its surface broken by stands of cattails in the occasional cypress tree that seemed to grow directly from the water itself. Spanish moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the air was thick with the smell of decomposition and new growth, life and death locked in their eternal dance. It should have been beautiful, Thomas thought, but instead it felt ominous, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to disturb its ancient slumber. "You're seriously considering buying that godforsaken swamp?" The voice belonged to his brother, Michael, who had driven out from Indianapolis after Thomas had made the mistake of mentioning his idea during a late-night phone call fueled with whiskey and desperation. Michael stood at the edge of the marsh wearing a $1,000 suit and an expression of barely contained disbelief, his Italian leather shoes already showing mud stains from their brief walk across the property. "It's not just a swamp," Thomas said, though even as the words left his mouth, he realized how hollow they sounded. "According to the geological surveys, this whole area used to be part of a major waterway system. The underground streams that fed into the Ohio River passed right through here." Michael laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Jesus Christ, Tommy, listen to yourself. You're talking like some kind of treasure hunter from a bad movie. This is real life. You're about to lose everything Dad and Grandpa built, and you want to throw away what little money you might be able to scrape together on a piece of land that nobody else wants." The truth of Michael's words hit like a physical blow. Thomas had always been the dreamer of the family, while Michael had pursued the practical path: business school, corporate law, a corner office in a downtown high-rise where he made more money in a month than Thomas had ever made in a year. Their father had been proud of both his sons, but Thomas had always suspected that Michael was the one he truly understood, the one who made sense in a world that rewarded careful planning and calculated risks. "Maybe you're right," Thomas said quietly, but his eyes remained fixed on the dark water. "Maybe I am chasing fantasies, but what's the alternative? Wait for the bank to take everything? Watch them tear down the farmhouse and turn Grandpa's fields into some corporate agribusiness operation? The alternative is to face reality," Michael shot back, his voice rising with the frustration that had been building throughout his visit. "Sell what you can while you still can. Use whatever money you get to start over somewhere else, doing something you're actually good at. Stop trying to be something you're not." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Stop trying to be something you're not. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of every failure, every wrong decision, every moment of doubt that had brought Thomas to this point. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe he had been trying to be his grandfather, trying to fill boots that were simply too big for his feet. But as he stood there, looking out over the marsh, Thomas felt something stirring deep in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but something more primal, more fundamental. It was the same feeling he had experienced as a child when his grandfather would take him exploring in the woods behind the farm, teaching him to read the signs that nature left behind, to see patterns where others saw only chaos. "Do you remember the story Grandpa used to tell about the old days? About the riverboats that used to come up the tributaries during high water seasons?" "Thomas," Michael sighed, "those were just stories, old man folklore. You can't base business decisions on bedtime stories." "But what if they weren't just stories?" Thomas turned to face his brother, and Michael was surprised by the intensity in his eyes. What if there's some truth behind the folklore? What if the reason nobody's ever been able to develop this land isn't because of some engineering problem, but because there's something down there that nobody's ever bothered to look for? The conversation continued for another hour, growing more heated as both brothers entrenched themselves in their positions. Michael threatened to have Thomas declared mentally incompetent if he went through with the purchase. Thomas accused Michael of being just another corporate suit who had forgotten where he came from. By the time Michael drove away, they weren't speaking, and Thomas was left alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that he was about to make either the best or worst decision of his life. That evening, Thomas sat in his kitchen with a bottle of his grandfather's bourbon and a stack of library books about local history. He had spent the afternoon at the Millbrook County Historical Society, a dusty repository of forgotten stories housed in a converted Victorian mansion on the town square. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Holbrook, had been delighted to help him research the area's past, pulling out boxes of documents that hadn't been touched in years. What he found was fascinating and frustrating in equal measure. There were indeed records of riverboat traffic in the area during the mid-1800s, with several references to a tributary called Serpent Creek that had since disappeared from modern maps. More intriguingly, there were shipping manifests and insurance records that suggest at least 3 vessels had been lost somewhere in the wetland system between 1847 and 1862, though the exact locations were vague and the descriptions contradictory. One document in particular had caught his attention, a letter from a steamboat captain named Jeremiah Blackwood to his wife dated September 15, 1859. The letter described a harrowing journey up what he called the Devil's Own waterway, carrying a cargo of considerable value to buyers in Louisville. Captain Blackwood wrote of strange currents and hidden obstacles that had forced him to navigate by instinct rather than experience, and he mentioned that several other vessels had met unfortunate ends in the same waters. The locals speak of cursed ground, but I believe the curse is nothing more than poor seamanship and worse luck. Still, I confess the place fills me with unease, as if the very water watches with malevolent eyes. The letter was the last communication anyone had received from Captain Blackwood or his vessel, the Mississippi Belle. According to the insurance records, the ship and its cargo were declared a total loss 6 months later, though the exact nature of the cargo was listed only as sundry valuable goods in trust. Thomas poured another glass of bourbon and stared at the photocopied documents spread across his table. Sundry valuable goods in trust. It was tantalizingly vague, the kind of description that could mean anything from farm equipment to fine china. But something about the phrasing nagged at him, suggested secrets and hidden value that went beyond normal commercial cargo. He picked up his phone and dialed Linda Chen's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the kind of artificial cheerfulness that real estate agents seem to practice in their sleep. "Thomas, I was hoping you'd call. Have you had a chance to think more about the Blackwater property? I have to tell you, I've had some renewed interest from other parties, so if you're serious about making an offer—" "I'll take it," Thomas interrupted, the words coming out before he could second-guess himself. $22,000, as advertised. Cash deal if you can arrange financing." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Thomas, are you absolutely certain about this? I mean, I'm thrilled, of course, but this is a significant investment, and you'll want to make sure you've considered all the implications." "I'm certain," he said, though his hands were shaking as he spoke. "How quickly can we close?" "Well, given that it's a cash deal and the property has been thoroughly inspected, probably within 2 weeks if all the paperwork goes smoothly. But Thomas, I have to ask, what are your plans for development? The drainage issues alone are going to require substantial capital investment, and—" "I'll figure that out as I go," Thomas said. "Just get me the papers." After he hung up, Thomas sat in the growing darkness of his kitchen, surrounded by historical documents and the weight of the decision he had just made. $22,000. It might as well have been $22 million for all the chance he had of coming up with that kind of money through conventional means. But desperation bred creativity, and Thomas was nothing if not desperate. He started making a list of everything he owned that might have value. The farm equipment was already mortgaged to the hilt, but there were smaller things. His grandfather's antique tool collection, his father's hunting guns, Margaret's grandmother's jewelry that she had left behind in her haste to escape their sinking ship. He calculated and recalculated, adding and subtracting, trying to find a way to make the numbers work. By the time the sun rose, Thomas had convinced himself that he could raise $15,000 if he liquidated everything he owned and cashed in his meager retirement account. The remaining $7,000 would have to come from somewhere else, a personal loan maybe, or a cash advance on credit cards that were already stretched to their limits. It was financial suicide, and he knew it. But as he looked out the window at the morning light reflecting off the surface of Blackwater Marsh, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. For the first time since Margaret had left, since the foreclosure notice had arrived, since his entire world had begun collapsing around him, he had a plan that was his own, a choice that nobody else could make for him. The phone started ringing early. Word traveled fast in a small town, and the news that Thomas Hartwell had bought the worthless Swampland spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The calls ranged from concerned to mocking, but they all carried the same underlying message. He had finally lost his mind completely. "Tommy, what the hell are you thinking?" This from Jake Morrison, who had been his best friend since high school and now ran the local grain elevator. "That land's been nothing but trouble for everyone who's touched it. Remember when Peterson tried to drain it back in '98? He lost 40 grand before he gave up." "I remember," Thomas said calmly. "But Peterson was trying to turn it into farmland. I have different plans."
What kind of plans? You gonna open a mosquito ranch? Train alligators for the circus? Thomas almost smiled at that. Something like that. The conversation continued along predictable lines, with Jake alternating between concern for his friend's mental state and frustration at his refusal to explain himself. When Thomas finally hung up, he realized that he was going to have to get used to these conversations. Everyone in town would want to know what he was planning, and nobody was going to believe the truth even if he told them. Which was just as well, because Thomas wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and increasingly frantic phone calls to potential buyers for his possessions. Thomas had underestimated both the difficulty of quickly liquidating assets and the emotional toll of watching his family's history get parceled out to strangers. His grandfather's hand tools, worn smooth by decades of use, went to a collector in Louisville for $800. His father's prize-winning show rifle found a new home with a hunter from Tennessee who paid cash and asked no questions. Margaret's jewelry, the pieces she had deemed not worth taking, disappeared into the back room of a pawn shop for far less than their actual value. Each sale felt like cutting away a piece of his family's legacy, but Thomas pressed on with the grim determination of a man who had run out of alternatives. By the end of the week, he had managed to scrape together $18,000. Still $4,000 short of what he needed, but close enough to convince Linda Chen to accept a partial payment with the balance due in 30 days. The closing took place on a gray Thursday morning in Linda's small office above the hardware store. Thomas signed document after document, his hand cramping from the repetitive motion, each signature bringing him closer to either salvation or complete ruin. When the last paper was notarized and the keys were placed in his palm, Thomas felt a strange mixture of elation and terror. He was now the proud owner of 50 acres of swampland that nobody else wanted, with 30 days to come up with $4,000 he didn't have, and absolutely no guarantee that his wild theory had any basis in reality. As he drove out to survey his new property, Thomas passed Dale Pritchard's truck parked at the edge of the marsh. Dale was standing beside the vehicle with several other men, all of them laughing and pointing at the sold sign that Linda had posted that morning. "Well, if it isn't the Swamp King himself, come to check on your underwater empire. Maybe you can breathe some of those fancy organic mosquitoes I keep hearing about." The laughter that followed was cruel and familiar, but for once it didn't sting the way it usually did. Thomas rolled down his window and looked directly at Dale, his voice calm and steady. "You know what, Dale? You might be right. This might be the stupidest thing I've ever done, but at least it's my stupid decision to make." He drove past without waiting for a response, leaving Dale and his audience standing beside the road. As he pulled up to the edge of his new property, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Win or lose, succeed or fail, he was finally playing his own game by his own rules. The marsh stretched out before him like a puzzle waiting to be solved, its dark waters holding secrets that might change everything or nothing at all. Thomas Hartwell climbed out of his truck, picked up the survey stakes that he had bought at the hardware store, and began the process of marking the boundaries of either his greatest triumph or his final failure. Either way, it was his to own. The first attempt at draining Blackwater Marsh came on a bitter November morning when the frost still clung to the cattails like crystal lace. Thomas had managed to rent a small portable pump from Henderson's equipment rental, the kind of machine typically used for flooded basements and construction sites, paying for 3 days with money he had borrowed against his pickup truck. The pump coughed to life with a diesel growl that seemed almost defiant against the vast silence of the marsh, its intake hose disappearing into the dark water like a mechanical serpent. For 6 hours, the pump worked steadily, sending a steady stream of marsh water through a discharge hose that Thomas had run to the lowest point of the adjacent county road ditch. The water that emerged was dark as coffee, thick with decades of decomposed vegetation and carrying the mineral scent of deep earth. Thomas stood beside the machine, watching the water level with an intensity that bordered on obsession, measuring progress in inches that seemed to mock his ambition. "Looks like you're winning the war against the water, General Custer," came a familiar voice from the road. Thomas turned to see Dale Pritchard leaning against his truck, accompanied by Jimmy Morrison and Pete Vandenberg, all 3 men wearing expressions of barely contained amusement. "Just getting started," Thomas replied, his voice steady, despite the frustration gnawing at his insides. The pump continued its laborious work, but the sound suddenly seemed feeble against the immensity of the task he had set for himself. "Getting started on what exactly?" Dale stepped closer, his boots squelching in the mud at the marsh's edge. "You're planning to turn this into a swimming pool? Maybe a nice little fishing pond for the mosquitoes?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He had learned that Dale's cruelty fed on reaction, and he was determined not to provide fuel for the fire. Instead, he checked the pump's fuel gauge and made a show of adjusting the intake hose, as if he were engaged in purposeful work rather than fighting a losing battle against physics and hydrology. "You know what I think?" Dale continued, emboldened by Thomas's silence. "I think you finally snapped. All that stress from losing the farm, your wife leaving, everybody in town talking about what a failure you are. It's finally driven you completely around the bend." The words hit home with surgical precision. Thomas felt his jaw clench involuntarily, and he saw Dale's satisfied smile in his peripheral vision. But before he could formulate a response, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Dale Pritchard, you're still the same small-minded bully you were in high school."
Everyone turned to see Dr. Eleanor Sage climbing out of a mud-splattered Jeep Cherokee. Eleanor was the county's only archaeologist, a woman in her early 50s who divided her time between teaching at the state university and conducting surveys for development projects. She was also, Thomas remembered, with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, someone who had never been impressed by Dale's wealth or social standing. "Well, if it isn't the bone digger," Dale said, but his tone had lost some of its edge. Eleanor had a reputation for intellectual ferocity that even Dale was reluctant to challenge directly. "Professor Sage," Thomas said, genuinely surprised to see her at his marsh, "what brings you out here?" Eleanor pulled on a pair of rubber boots and approached the edge of the water. "I heard through the academic grapevine that someone had finally bought the Blackwater property and was planning to drain it. From a historical perspective, that's actually quite exciting." Dale let out a snort of derision. "Exciting? It's a worthless swamp. Always has been, always will be." Eleanor ignored him completely, addressing her next words to Thomas. "You know, there are several references in the early settlement records to this area being significant to the indigenous peoples who lived here before European colonization. The Shawnee, specifically, seem to consider these wetlands sacred ground. There are also numerous accounts of unusual discoveries being made whenever the water levels dropped naturally during drought years." "What kind of discoveries?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. "Oh, pottery fragments, stone tools, occasionally pieces of metal that didn't match anything the tribes would have made themselves." Eleanor walked along the muddy shoreline, her trained eyes scanning the exposed earth. There was one account from 1923 of a farmer named Jessup who found what he described as ship's timber during a particularly dry summer. Of course, nobody took him seriously at the time. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. Ship's timber. The phrase seemed to echo in his mind, connecting with the historical documents he had studied and the growing conviction that his instincts about this place might actually be correct. "That's just old folklore and wishful thinking," Dale said, but Thomas noticed that his voice lacked its usual conviction. "People see what they want to see, especially when they're desperate." "Maybe," Eleanor replied with academic neutrality. "But folklore often contains kernels of truth. The fact that you're undertaking such an ambitious drainage project suggests you might have some specific theories about what could be hidden beneath the surface." She looked directly at Thomas, with eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Would you be interested in having some professional consultation? I'd be happy to document whatever you find, assuming you find anything at all." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. Thomas realized that having a respected academic involved in his project would lend credibility to what everyone else saw as the desperate delusion of a broken man. It might also provide access to equipment and expertise he couldn't afford on his own. "I'd welcome any help you can offer, though I should warn you I'm operating on a pretty tight budget here." Eleanor smiled. "Consider it pro bono research. I've been looking for an excuse to investigate this area for years, but I never had a property owner willing to disturb the site. Your drainage project might provide the perfect opportunity for a proper archaeological survey." Dale's expression darkened. "So now we've got two crazy people chasing fantasies in a mud puddle. This ought to be entertaining." The only thing that's entertaining, Dale, is watching a grown man derive so much pleasure from other people's struggles. Some of us prefer to invest our energy in more constructive pursuits. The confrontation might have escalated, but the pump chose that moment to sputter and die. Its fuel tank finally empty. The sudden silence seemed to drain the tension from the group, leaving everyone staring at the pump that had been laboring so futilely against the marsh's seemingly infinite capacity for self-replenishment. "Looks like your big plans hit a snag," Dale said, but his heart didn't seem to be in the mockery anymore. Eleanor's presence had changed the dynamic, introducing an element of legitimacy that made simple ridicule feel inappropriate. Thomas walked over to the pump and began the process of disconnecting the hoses. "Just a temporary setback. I'll be back tomorrow with more fuel and a better strategy." As Dale and his companions climbed back into their truck, Thomas heard Jimmy Morrison's voice carrying across the water. "You really think there might be something down there, Pete? I mean, all that talk about ship's timber and sacred ground?" "Hell, I don't know. But if there is something, and if Tommy actually finds it, Dale's gonna look pretty stupid for all the grief he's been giving him." Their voices faded as the truck pulled away, leaving Thomas alone with Eleanor and the vast expanse of dark water that had barely acknowledged his first assault. The professor was still walking the shoreline, occasionally kneeling to examine something in the mud or making notes in a waterproof notebook. "You know," she said, without looking up from her observations, "the indigenous peoples didn't avoid places like this because they were superstitious. They were incredibly practical people who understood the landscape in ways that European settlers never bothered to learn. If they considered this ground sacred, it was probably because something significant happened here." Thomas joined her at the water's edge, looking out over the marsh with new eyes. "What kind of significance?"
Could be anything. A battle, a burial ground, a place where important ceremonies took place. Eleanor stood and brushed mud from her knees. Or it could be that they recognized this area as a natural trap, a place where things went in but didn't come out. The implications of her words settled over Thomas like a blanket. A natural trap. He thought about Captain Blackwood's letter, about the mysterious currents and hidden obstacles that had claimed multiple vessels in these waters. What if the indigenous peoples had understood something about this place that later settlers had ignored to their peril? "Professor Sage," Thomas said slowly, "hypothetically speaking, if a steamboat had run aground somewhere in this marsh back in the 1850s, would it still be there?" Eleanor considered the question with academic seriousness. "Well, the anaerobic conditions in a marsh like this would actually be excellent for preservation. Wood, metal, organic materials, they could all survive remarkably well if they were buried quickly in the sediment. The lack of oxygen prevents most forms of decay. And if that steamboat happened to be carrying valuable cargo, then you'd have what amounts to a time capsule. Perfectly preserved artifacts from the mid-19th century, potentially worth a fortune to museums and private collectors." They stood in comfortable silence for minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "Thomas, I need to ask you something directly. Do you have reason to believe there's a specific vessel buried in this marsh? Because if you do, there are legal and ethical considerations we need to discuss." Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Walking back to his truck, he retrieved the folder of historical documents he had copied at the county library.
He handed Eleanor the letter from Captain Blackwood and the insurance records for the Mississippi Belle, watching her face as she read through the materials with scholarly concentration. This is fascinating. I'd never seen these particular documents before. The description of the cargo as sundry valuable goods in trust is intriguing. That was often code for high-value items that the shipper didn't want to specify in public records. What kind of high-value items? Eleanor's eyes gleamed with professional interest. Could be anything. Gold, silver, artwork, rare books, jewelry. The mid-1850s were boom times in certain parts of the country. Wealthy people were moving assets around, sometimes for legitimate business reasons, sometimes to avoid taxes or creditors. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, and if someone found cargo like that today, well, that would depend on a lot of factors. Maritime salvage law is complicated, especially when it comes to vessels that were lost in inland waters. But generally speaking, if you own the property where something is discovered, and if you can establish that the original owners are deceased and have no living heirs with legitimate claims, let's just say you'd have a strong legal position. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Thomas turned to see a convoy of trucks and equipment making its way down the county road, led by a massive industrial pump truck that dwarfed his rented machine like a whale beside a minnow. "Thomas Hartwell," Bobby called out as he approached, "I hear you're having some trouble with a drainage project." "I didn't call for any additional equipment. I can't afford." "It's not about what you can afford," Bobby interrupted with a grin. "It's about what makes for good entertainment. Word's getting around about your little treasure hunt, and frankly, a lot of us are curious to see what you might find down there." "I don't understand."
Bobby gestured toward the other trucks, which were disgorging crews of workers and an impressive array of pumps, generators, and earth-moving equipment. "Let's just say you've got some investors who are willing to front the costs of a proper drainage operation in exchange for a percentage of whatever you might discover." Thomas felt a mixture of elation and apprehension. What kind of investors? What kind of percentage? "Nothing too unreasonable. 60-40 split, with you keeping the 60%. We cover all the operational costs, provide the equipment and labor, handle any legal complications that might arise." Bobby's expression was friendly but businesslike. "Course, if you don't find anything, you're not out any additional money, but you also don't owe us anything." It was, Thomas realized, the kind of deal that desperate men either embraced or regretted for the rest of their lives. The offer solved his immediate problem of not having enough resources to properly drain the marsh, but it also meant sharing whatever he might find with people whose motivations he didn't fully understand. "Who exactly are these investors?" he asked. Bobby's grin widened. "Well, funny thing about that. Turns out Dale Pritchard isn't the only successful businessman in this county. There are others who've been watching your situation with interest, and they figure that even if there's only a 10% chance you're onto something, the potential payoff makes it worth the gamble." Thomas looked out over the marsh, then back at the impressive array of equipment that had appeared as if by magic. Professional pumps capable of moving thousands of gallons per hour, excavators that could precisely remove sediment and debris, generators powerful enough to run the operation around the clock if necessary. "I need some time to think about this," he said. "Course you do, but don't think too long. This equipment's expensive to mobilize, and my crews have other projects waiting. You've got until tomorrow morning to decide." As the convoy prepared to leave, Bobby handed Thomas a business card and a thick folder of documents. "That's the formal contract if you're interested. Have your lawyer look it over, though I suspect you might find the terms more favorable than anything else you're likely to get."
After the trucks disappeared, Thomas and Eleanor were left alone beside the marsh, the silence somehow deeper for the brief intrusion of mechanical noise and human ambition. Thomas thumbed through the contract, trying to decipher the legal language while Eleanor examined the industrial pump truck specifications on Bobby's business card. 60-40 split isn't terrible, especially considering you'd be getting the larger share without any financial risk. But you need to understand that accepting this deal changes everything. This stops being your private treasure hunt and becomes a commercial salvage operation with multiple stakeholders. Thomas knew she was right. The romantic notion of discovering buried treasure through his own hard work and determination was giving way to the complex realities of modern business partnerships. But he also knew that without significant resources, his chances of successfully draining the marsh were virtually non-existent. "What would you do?" he asked. Eleanor considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "As an archaeologist, I'd want to ensure that any historical artifacts are properly documented and preserved, regardless of their commercial value. As someone who's watched you get beaten down by circumstances beyond your control, I think I'd take the deal and worry about the complications later." That evening, Thomas sat in his kitchen with the contract spread across the same table where he had studied the historical documents about Captain Blackwood and the Mississippi Belle. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the basic terms seemed straightforward. Bobby Hawkins and his unnamed investors would provide all necessary equipment and labor to drain the marsh completely. In exchange, they would receive 40% of the value of anything discovered, with Thomas retaining 60% and full ownership of the land itself. There were provisions for archaeological documentation, environmental compliance, and dispute resolution. There were also clauses that made it clear that if nothing of value was found, Thomas would owe nothing to his partners, but he would also have no claim on the costs they had incurred. As he read through the contract for the third time, Thomas realized that he was looking at either the solution to all his problems or the beginning of complications he couldn't yet imagine. Either way, it represented action, forward movement, the chance to turn his desperate gamble into something with real potential for success. The phone rang just as he was reaching for a pen to sign the documents. The caller ID showed Margaret's number, and Thomas hesitated before answering. They hadn't spoken since she had taken Sarah and moved in with her sister in Louisville, and he wasn't sure he was ready for whatever conversation this might bring. "Hello, Thomas." Margaret's voice was carefully neutral, the tone she had perfected during the final months of their marriage when every conversation had become a potential battlefield. "Margaret, how are you? How's Sarah?" "She's fine. She's doing well in her new school, making friends." There was a pause, and Thomas could hear the television in the background, the sound of normal family life continuing without him. "I heard about what you're doing with the Swampland." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "What did you hear?" "That you bought some worthless marsh and you're trying to drain it, looking for a buried treasure. People are saying you've completely lost your mind." The words stung, partly because of who they came from, and partly because Thomas had entertained the same thoughts himself during his darkest moments of doubt. "People say a lot of things." "Thomas, listen to me. I know things have been difficult since I left, and I know you're feeling desperate about the farm situation, but this isn't the answer. You're just going to lose what little money you have left chasing some fantasy." What if it's not a fantasy? The question came out more defensively than Thomas had intended. What if there really is something down there? Margaret's sigh carried clearly over the phone connection.
Then you'll find it, and it'll be worth about as much as everything else you've touched lately. Thomas, you have to stop this. Come to Louisville, stay with us while you figure out what to do next. Sarah misses you, and What? I miss the man you used to be before all this started consuming you. The man who could tell the difference between reasonable risk and desperate fantasy. After Margaret hung up, Thomas sat in the growing darkness of his kitchen, staring at the unsigned contract. Her words echoed in his mind, mixing with the voices of everyone who had told him he was crazy, everyone who had written him off as another failed farmer chasing impossible dreams. But as he looked out the window toward the marsh, barely visible in the moonlight, Thomas felt the same stubborn determination that had sustained his grandfather through the Depression and his father through the farm crisis of the 1980s. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe there was nothing beneath that dark water but mud and disappointment. Maybe he was just another desperate man making bad decisions. But maybe, just maybe, he was about to prove everyone wrong. Thomas picked up the pen and signed his name at the bottom of the contract, sealing his fate with strokes of black ink that seemed to glow in the lamplight. Tomorrow, Bobby Hawkins and his crews would begin the largest drainage operation in Millbrook County's history, and Thomas Hartwell would discover whether his instincts had led him to salvation or destruction.
Either way, there would be no going back. The night was quiet, except for the distant sound of water moving through hidden channels beneath the earth, carrying with it the secrets that had waited in darkness for more than a century and a half. By tomorrow evening, those secrets would begin their journey toward the light, and Thomas would learn whether he was a visionary or a fool. In his heart, he already knew which one he hoped to be. The industrial pumps roared to life at dawn on Tuesday, November 15th, their synchronized thunder echoing across Millbrook County like the heartbeat of some mechanical giant. Thomas stood at the edge of what had been Blackwater Marsh just 24 hours earlier, watching as Bobby Hawkins' crews orchestrated the most ambitious drainage operation the region had ever witnessed. Where once there had been 50 acres of dark water and mystery, now there stretched an expanding moonscape of exposed mud, revealing the marsh's secrets inch by agonizing inch. The transformation was breathtaking in its scope and violence. 4 massive pumps, each capable of moving 5,000 gallons per minute, worked in perfect coordination to strip away the water that had hidden this place's secrets for generations. The discharge pipes, thick as subway tunnels, carried an endless stream of marsh water to settling ponds that Bobby's crew had excavated overnight in the adjacent fields. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar of engines and rushing water that could be heard from miles away, drawing curious onlookers from across the county. By noon, the water level had dropped 12 feet, exposing vast expanses of black mud that steamed in the cold air like the breath of some underground beast. Eleanor Sage moved through the muck with the careful precision of a battlefield surgeon, her trained eyes scanning for anything that didn't belong in the natural order of decomposed vegetation and aquatic sediment. She had brought a team of graduate students from the university, young men and women who attacked the archaeological survey with the enthusiasm of treasure hunters and the discipline of scientists. "Over here!"
The shout came from Jennifer Walsh, a doctoral candidate in American history who had been documenting artifacts in the northeastern quadrant of the exposed marsh bed. "I've got something big!" Thomas and Eleanor hurried through the mud, their boots making sucking sounds with each step. The terrain was treacherous. What looked like solid ground could suddenly give way to pockets of liquid mud that seemed to reach toward the center of the earth. But Jennifer's discovery was worth the struggle. Protruding from the muck at a 45-degree angle was a section of timber so perfectly preserved that it looked like it had been placed there yesterday rather than buried for more than a century. "That's definitely ship construction," Eleanor said, kneeling beside the exposed beam despite the mud that immediately soaked through her pants. "Look at the joinery, the way it's been shaped. This isn't driftwood or construction lumber. This is part of a vessel's framework." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared at the timber. After months of doubt and ridicule, after watching his life fall apart piece by piece, he was looking at proof that his instincts were correct. There indeed is a ship buried in this marsh, and if his research was accurate, it was the Mississippi Belle, the vessel that had vanished in 1859, carrying its mysterious cargo of sundry valuable goods in trust. "How much more do you think is down there?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Eleanor was examining the timber with a magnifying glass, noting details that would help identify the vessel's age and construction method. "Hard to say without more excavation. But based on the angle of this beam and the way it's positioned, I'd guess we're looking at a substantial portion of the hull. Maybe even the entire vessel if it sank intact." Word of the discovery spread through Millbrook County faster than wildfire in August. By mid-afternoon, the county road was lined with pickup trucks and cars as people abandoned their daily routines to witness what was being called either the archaeological find of the century or the most expensive wild goose chase in local history. The crowd included everyone from genuine curiosity seekers to professional skeptics, but they all shared the same hypnotic fascination with watching the past emerge from its muddy grave. Dale Pritchard arrived just as Bobby Hawkins' excavation crew was preparing to expose more of the buried vessel. He parked his gleaming pickup at the front of the growing crowd, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the operation that was making him look increasingly foolish with each passing hour. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas heard someone say behind him. "Tommy Hartwell might actually be onto something." The voice belonged to Frank Mueller, who owned the farm supply store and had been one of the more vocal skeptics of Thomas's Swampland purchase. Now he stood with a cluster of other local businessmen, all of them staring at the exposed timber with expressions of grudging amazement. "Don't get too excited," Dale said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Could be anything down there. Probably just some old bards that got stuck in a flood 50 years ago. Finding an old piece of wood doesn't make Tommy a millionaire." But even Dale's trademark confidence seemed strained. The timber that Jennifer had discovered was clearly very old, and the careful way Eleanor's team was documenting and exposing it suggested they were dealing with something historically significant rather than modern debris. As the afternoon wore on, the excavation revealed more of the buried vessel's structure. What had started as a single exposed beam gradually became a complex latticework of ribs and planking that clearly outlined the hull of a substantial riverboat. The preservation was remarkable. The anaerobic conditions of the marsh had protected the wood from decay, leaving details intact that would have been destroyed within years in normal soil conditions. "Thomas, you need to see this." Eleanor's voice carried a note of excitement that she had been trying to suppress all day.
She was kneeling beside a section of hull that the excavators had just exposed, carefully brushing mud away from what appeared to be metal plating. Thomas made his way across the excavation site, followed by Bobby Hawkins and several members of the crowd who had been granted permission to observe the work up close. What Eleanor had uncovered was a brass nameplate, green with verdigris, but still clearly readable. Mississippi Belle, New Orleans, 1857. The silence that followed was profound. Even the skeptics in the crowd seemed to grasp the significance of the discovery. This wasn't just any random vessel that had been lost in the marsh. This was specifically the Mississippi Belle, the steamboat that had vanished in 1859, carrying its mysterious cargo up the tributary waterways towards Louisville. Sweet Jesus, it's really here. The whole damn thing is really here. Thomas stared at the nameplate, feeling a mixture of vindication and terror. He had been right about the ship, but now came the truly important question. Was Captain Blackwood's cargo still aboard? And if so, what exactly had the captain been carrying that was valuable enough to be described in insurance documents as worth a substantial fortune? "We need to proceed very carefully from here," Eleanor said, addressing both Thomas and Bobby. "If this vessel contains artifacts of historical significance, we have legal obligations to document everything properly. And if there's valuable cargo aboard, well, let's just say we want to make sure we handle this in a way that protects everyone's interests." The work continued until sunset, with the excavation crew carefully exposing more of the Mississippi Belle's hull, while Eleanor's team documented every detail with photographs, measurements, and detailed drawings. By the time darkness forced them to stop, they had revealed approximately 60 feet of the vessel's length and established that it was sitting upright in the marsh sediment, suggesting it had sunk intact rather than breaking apart in a violent wreck. That evening, Thomas sat in Bobby Hawkins' construction trailer, which had been set up at the edge of the excavation site as a temporary command center. The trailer was crowded with maps, photographs, and documents related to the project. But the centerpiece was a detailed drawing that Eleanor had made, showing the exposed portion of the Mississippi Belle in relation to the overall marsh layout. "Based on what we've uncovered so far," Eleanor explained, pointing to various sections of her drawing, "I estimate we're looking at a vessel approximately 120 feet in length. That would make it a substantial riverboat for its era. Definitely large enough to carry significant cargo loads." Bobby leaned forward in his chair, his businessman's instincts clearly engaged. "How long do you think it'll take to expose the cargo areas?" "That depends on what we find as we dig deeper," Eleanor replied. "The good news is that the hull appears to be structurally sound, so we should be able to access the interior compartments without too much difficulty. The bad news is that we need to proceed slowly to avoid damaging anything that might be inside." Thomas had been quiet throughout the discussion, overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of his desperate gamble into a complex operation involving dozens of people and equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The modest farmer who had been mocked for buying worthless swampland had somehow become the central figure in what was shaping up to be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the region's history. "There's something else we need to discuss," Bobby said, pulling out a manila folder that Thomas hadn't seen before. "I've been getting calls all day from people who want to get involved in this project. Museums, private collectors, even some Hollywood types who think this might make a good movie." He spread several documents across the table, each representing a different proposal for partnership, purchase, or licensing arrangements. The numbers that Thomas saw made his head spin. Offers in the hundreds of thousands of dollars just for the rights to document the discovery, before anyone even knew what the cargo might contain. "The point is," Bobby continued, We need to make some decisions about how we want to handle this. Do we keep it simple and just focus on recovering whatever's in the ship? Do we turn it into a full-scale archaeological project with universities and museums involved? Do we sell the whole thing to someone with deeper pockets and more experience? Eleanor had been studying the various proposals with professional interest. From a historical preservation standpoint, I'd strongly recommend involving legitimate academic institutions. This vessel represents an incredibly valuable window into mid-19th century river commerce and technology. The historical significance could even be greater than any monetary value we might find in the cargo holds. Thomas appreciated Eleanor's perspective, but he also couldn't ignore the financial realities that had driven him to this point. He was still facing foreclosure on his farm, still dealing with debt that threatened to destroy what remained of his family's legacy. Historical significance was important, but it wouldn't pay off his creditors or give him a chance to rebuild his life. "What I want to know," he said finally, "is what happens if we find Captain Blackwood's cargo, and what happens if we don't. I need to understand the best-case and worst-case scenarios before I agree to involve anyone else in this project." Bobby and Eleanor exchanged glances, and Thomas sensed that they had already discussed this question between themselves. "Worst case," Bobby said, "we finish excavating the ship and find that the cargo compartments are empty or contain nothing of significant value. In that scenario, you've still got a historically important vessel that museums and collectors would be interested in, but probably not at the life-changing money level you're hoping for." "Best case?" Thomas asked.
"Best case," Eleanor said slowly. "Captain Blackwood was carrying something extraordinary. Gold, silver, artwork, rare documents, something that would have been worth a fortune in 1859 and would be worth an even greater fortune today. Given the way the cargo was described in the insurance documents, and given the lengths Blackwood went to keep the details secret, there's reason to hope we might be dealing with something truly special." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the trailer door. Bobby opened it to reveal Dale Pritchard, looking uncharacteristically humble and nervous. "Sorry to bother you folks," Dale said, his usual swagger notably absent. "I was wondering if I could have a word with Thomas." Thomas felt a surge of satisfaction at seeing his longtime tormentor reduced to asking for favors, but he also recognized that Dale's presence probably meant complications he wasn't prepared to handle. "What's on your mind, Dale?" Dale stepped into the trailer, his eyes taking in the maps and documents that covered every available surface. "Look, Tommy, I know we've had our differences over the years. I know I haven't always been supportive of your decisions." The understatement was so massive that Thomas almost laughed, but something in Dale's expression suggested this conversation was important enough to take seriously. "I'm listening." "The thing is, what you've accomplished here today has gotten people talking, important people, people with the kind of resources that could turn this discovery into something really significant." Dale paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. "I've got connections in the maritime salvage industry, people who specialize in recovering valuable cargo from historical wrecks. They're interested in getting involved, and they're prepared to make substantial financial commitments." Bobby's expression had hardened. "What kind of financial commitments?" "The kind that would guarantee Thomas walks away from this project as a wealthy man, regardless of what we find in that ship's cargo holds." He pulled out his phone and showed them a text message with a dollar figure that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. "That's what they're prepared to pay just for exclusive salvage rights, before we even know what's down there." The number was more money than Thomas had ever imagined having. It was enough to pay off all his debts, save his farm, and rebuild his life on whatever terms he chose. It was also, he realized, probably a fraction of what the cargo might actually be worth if his theories about Captain Blackwood proved correct. "What's the catch?" Eleanor asked, her academic instincts clearly suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. Dale's discomfort was visible. "They'd want complete control over the salvage operation. They'd handle all the excavation, all the recovery, all the legal and media aspects. Thomas would get his money, but he'd essentially be bought out of any further involvement in the project." The trailer fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications. Thomas would be guaranteed financial security, but he would also be giving up the chance to see his amazing discovery through to its conclusion. He would be trading the possibility of extraordinary wealth and historical significance for the certainty of merely substantial wealth and complete anonymity. "I need time to think about this," Thomas said finally.
"Of course you do," Dale replied, "but don't take too long. Interest in this project is growing by the hour, and there are other ways these people could get involved if they decide they don't want to work with you directly." After Dale left, the 3 remaining occupants of the trailer sat in contemplative silence. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the security team that Bobby had hired to watch over the excavation site overnight. The discovery of the Mississippi Belle had transformed Thomas's modest drainage project into something that required professional protection and round-the-clock surveillance. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, looking at his 2 partners. "I think," Bobby said carefully, "that Dale's people are probably legitimate, and their offer is probably real. I also think they wouldn't be making that kind of offer unless they had reason to believe the potential payoff is much, much larger." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "Maritime salvage companies don't invest that kind of money in speculative projects. They've obviously done their homework about Captain Blackwood and the Mississippi Belle, and they've reached conclusions that make them very confident about what we're going to find." Thomas walked to the trailer window and looked out over the excavation site, where powerful floodlights illuminated the exposed hull of the steamboat that had been waiting in darkness for more than 150 years. Tomorrow, they would begin the delicate process of accessing the cargo compartments, and he would finally learn whether his desperate gamble had been vindicated or whether he was simply prolonging the inevitable disaster that had been stalking him for months. But tonight, for the first time since his world had begun collapsing, Thomas Hartwell felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Whether that feeling would survive the revelations of tomorrow remained to be seen. Outside, the Mississippi Belle waited in its muddy grave, holding secrets that would soon transform not just Thomas's life, but the entire understanding of what had been hidden beneath the waters of Blackwater Marsh for more than 160 years. The answers were so close he could almost touch them. The morning of November 16th dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting the exposed hull of the Mississippi Belle in crystalline patterns that made the ancient timber look like something from a fairy tale. Thomas arrived at the excavation site before sunrise, unable to sleep for the anticipation that had been building in his chest like steam in a pressure cooker. Today, they would breach the cargo compartments, Today, he would learn whether Captain Jeremiah Blackwood had taken his secrets to the grave or whether those secrets had been waiting patiently in the mud for someone desperate enough to look for them. Eleanor Sage was already at work, directing her team of graduate students as they prepared the specialized equipment needed to safely access the interior. The process was painstaking, slow. Each step had to be documented, each artifact preserved, each discovery recorded with the meticulous care that separated legitimate archaeology from treasure hunting. But Thomas could see the excitement in Eleanor's eyes, the barely controlled enthusiasm of a scholar on the verge of a breakthrough that could define her entire career. "We're going to start with the stern compartments," Eleanor explained, as Bobby Hawkins' excavation crew gathered around a detailed diagram of the Mississippi Belle's layout. Based on the vessel's design and the period when it was built, that's where Captain Blackwood would have stored his most valuable cargo, items that needed to be kept secure and dry during the journey. The first breakthrough came at 9:47 a.m. when excavator operator Jimmy Reeves carefully removed the last section of mud and debris that had been protecting the ship's stern cargo hatch. What they found beneath took everyone's breath away. The hatch cover itself was still intact, its heavy oak planking sealed with what appeared to be multiple layers of tar and canvas, Captain Blackwood's desperate attempt to protect his cargo from the water that was already beginning to claim his vessel.
"My God," whispered Dr. Patricia Holbrook, a maritime historian from the State University who had arrived overnight to observe the excavation. "The preservation is absolutely extraordinary. It's like they sealed this compartment yesterday." If you're on the edge of your seat wondering what Thomas found in that cargo hold, smash that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will blow your mind. Thomas stood at the edge of the excavation pit, his heart hammering as Eleanor's team began the delicate process of removing the hatch cover. Each nail had to be photographed and documented before removal. Each piece of sealing material was carefully preserved for later analysis. The process took nearly 2 hours, but finally, the cargo compartment of the Mississippi Belle lay open to daylight for the first time since 1859. What they saw inside defied every expectation. The compartment was filled with wooden crates and metal strongboxes, stacked with military precision and wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected them from moisture for more than a century and a half. Some of the containers bore shipping labels written in fading ink, while others displayed official seals and government markings that Eleanor immediately recognized as significant. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice tight with controlled excitement, "I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that Captain Blackwood was carrying more than just commercial cargo." As the excavation team carefully lifted the first crate from the cargo hold, the crowd that had gathered along the county road fell silent. Even Dale Pritchard, who had arrived early with his maritime salvage contacts, seemed struck dumb by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just the recovery of a lost steamboat. This was the unveiling of a time capsule that had been sealed at one of the most turbulent periods in American history. The first crate, once opened under Eleanor's supervision, contained Confederate currency and government bonds, thousands of them, wrapped in oiled silk and preserved in pristine condition. The second crate held Union currency and federal securities. The third contained what appeared to be private banknotes from institutions in New Orleans, Louisville, and Cincinnati. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered. "Blackwood was running currency." Eleanor was examining the documents with a magnifying glass, her academic training warring with the magnitude of the discovery. "This isn't just currency running," she said slowly. "Look at the dates on these bonds, the serial numbers on the banknotes. This represents financial instruments from both sides of a conflict that was about to tear the country apart." As more crates were opened throughout the morning, the scope of Captain Blackwood's cargo became clear. He had been carrying a fortune in negotiable securities, rare coins, and paper money from across the divided nation.
the kind of liquid wealth that desperate people moved when they sensed that their world was about to change forever. But the most stunning discovery came when they opened the metal strongboxes that had been secured in the deepest part of the cargo hold. Gold. More gold than Thomas had ever imagined seeing in one place. Coins, bars, jewelry, and raw nuggets packed in sawdust and wrapped in leather pouches. Some of it bore the stamps of California mining operations. Other pieces showed the craftsmanship of New Orleans goldsmiths. There were Mexican pesos, Spanish doubloons, and American eagles, all carefully cataloged and organized as if Captain Blackwood had been operating a mobile bank rather than a simple transportation service. "How much do you think it's worth?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. Eleanor was making rapid calculations on a waterproof tablet, her fingers flying over the surface as she tried to estimate the value of what they had discovered. In terms of historical significance, priceless. In terms of monetary value, she paused, double-checking her figures. Based on current precious metal prices and the numismatic value of some of these coins, I'd estimate we're looking at somewhere between $160 and $200 million. The silence that followed was profound. Thomas felt his knees go weak, and he had to grip the edge of the excavation pit to keep from collapsing. $160 million! The number was so large it didn't seem real, so far beyond his experience that he couldn't quite comprehend what it meant for his life. That's assuming that we can establish clear legal ownership and that the collection remains intact. There will be questions about salvage rights, historical preservation requirements, and potential claims from descendants of the original owners. But even as she spoke about potential complications, Thomas could see the wonder in her eyes. They had discovered something extraordinary, something that would reshape the understanding of how wealth moved through America during the turbulent years leading up to the Civil War. Captain Blackwood hadn't just been a steamboat operator, he had been facilitating the movement of enormous sums of money for people who understood that the old order was about to collapse. By noon, word of the treasure discovery had spread far beyond Millbrook County. News trucks began arriving from Indianapolis, Louisville, and even Chicago, their satellite dishes sprouting like mechanical flowers along the county road. Reporters with microphones and cameras tried to get close enough to the excavation site to capture footage of the ongoing recovery, but Bobby's security team kept them at a respectful distance. Thomas found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never wanted or expected. One moment he was a failed farmer facing foreclosure, and the next he was being hailed as the man who had made one of the largest treasure discoveries in American history. The transformation was dizzying and more than a little terrifying. "Mr. Hartwell! Thomas!" The shouts came from dozens of reporters who had set up an impromptu press conference area at the edge of his property. "How did you know the treasure was there? What are your plans for the money? Are you going to sell the collection?" Thomas stood at the edge of the excavation pit, looking down at the Mississippi Belle and its incredible cargo, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened to his life in the span of a few hours. This morning he was a desperate man, clinging to a wild theory. Now he was wealthy beyond his most optimistic dreams, and everyone wanted to know how he had pulled off what they were calling a miracle. The answer, he realized, was both simpler and more complex than anyone would believe. He had succeeded because he had been willing to risk everything on an idea that everyone else had dismissed as impossible. He had succeeded because he had been desperate enough to see patterns where others saw only chaos.
He had succeeded because he had refused to accept the verdict that his life was destined to be a failure. Eleanor approached him as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the excavation site. "Eleanor, we need to talk about next steps. The recovery is going to take several more days, and we need to make decisions about security, preservation, and legal representation. What do you recommend?" "I recommend that you resist any pressure to make quick decisions about selling or dispersing the collection. This discovery is going to attract attention from all over the world: museums, private collectors, government agencies, treasure hunters, and probably some people whose motives aren't entirely legitimate." Thomas nodded, understanding the wisdom of her advice. But he also couldn't ignore the practical realities of his situation. His farm was still facing foreclosure. His debts were still mounting. His wife and daughter were still living apart from him, convinced that he had lost his mind pursuing impossible dreams. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "how long do you think it would take to liquidate enough of this collection to pay off my debts and get my life back on track?" She considered the question carefully. "If you were willing to sell some of the more common pieces at current market prices, probably a few weeks once we establish clear legal ownership. But Thomas, I have to tell you, if you can afford to be patient, the value of this collection could increase dramatically over time. Some of these pieces are museum-quality artifacts that could appreciate substantially if they're properly marketed."
That evening, Thomas sat in his farmhouse kitchen for the first time in weeks, surrounded by the same bills and foreclosure notices that had driven him to desperation, but viewing them through completely different eyes. The numbers that had seemed insurmountable yesterday now looked like minor inconveniences that could be resolved with a phone call and a bank transfer. But the money, he was beginning to realize, was only part of what had changed. The discovery of the Mississippi Belle had transformed him from Millbrook County's favorite example of failure into something approaching a local hero. People who had been mocking him for months were now calling to congratulate him, to invite him to dinner, to ask for his advice on their own investment decisions. The transformation was gratifying, but also slightly hollow. Thomas understood that the respect he was suddenly receiving had more to do with his wealth than with any fundamental change in who he was as a person. The same instincts and determination that had led him to the treasure had been there all along, but nobody had been interested in recognizing them when he was poor. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Margaret's number, and Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he answered. "I saw the news," Margaret said without preamble. "Is it true? Did you really find what they're saying you found?" "It's true," Thomas replied. $160 million, give or take. Maybe one saw the appraisals are complete." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Margaret spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "Thomas, I don't know what to say. I never thought, I knew you believed in what you were doing, but I never imagined." "Nobody did," Thomas said gently. "Most of the time, including me." "What happens now? What are you going to do with all that money?" It was a question Thomas had been asking himself all day. The practical answer was obvious: pay off his debts, save his farm, secure his family's future. But the deeper question was more complex. How did a man rebuild his life after proving that everything everyone believed about him was wrong? "I'm going to pay off the farm debt first. Then I'm going to set up college funds for Sarah and any other kids we might have. After that, I think I'm going to try to understand what Captain Blackwood was really doing, why he was carrying all that money, where it came from, and where it was supposed to go." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like you, Thomas. Finding treasure isn't enough. You have to solve the mystery, too." "Maybe that's what I'm good at. Maybe I'm not cut out to be a conventional farmer or businessman. Maybe I'm supposed to be the guy who figures out the puzzles that other people can't." When they hung up, Thomas felt lighter than he had in months. Margaret hadn't said she was coming home, hadn't apologized for leaving, hadn't promised that everything would return to the way it used to be. But for the first time since she had walked out, they had talked like partners, facing a shared future, rather than strangers managing the aftermath of a failed relationship. Over the following days, as Eleanor's team completed the excavation of the Mississippi Belle and cataloged its extraordinary cargo, Thomas began to understand the magnitude of what Captain Blackwood was attempting in those final months before the Civil War. The pattern that emerged from the financial documents suggested a sophisticated network of people who had been moving wealth across regional and political boundaries, preparing for a conflict they saw coming before it became obvious to everyone else.
Blackwood wasn't just a steamboat captain, Eleanor explained during one of their evening strategy sessions. He was a crucial link in a chain of financial operatives who were trying to preserve wealth that might otherwise be destroyed by war. Some of this money probably belonged to Southern planters who were converting their assets to portable form. Some of it might have belonged to Northern industrialists who were positioning themselves to profit from military contracts. The historical implications were staggering, but Thomas found himself equally fascinated by the personal story of a man who had risked everything to transport a fortune through dangerous waters, only to meet his end in the very marsh that Thomas had bought on impulse and desperation. As news of the discovery spread nationally and internationally, Thomas began receiving offers that dwarfed even Dale Pritchard's maritime salvage contacts. Museums wanted to acquire the entire collection. Private collectors were bidding against each other for individual pieces. Movie producers were offering enormous sums of money for the film rights to his story. Investment advisors were proposing strategies for managing and growing his newfound wealth. But the offer that surprised him most came from an unexpected source. The Smithsonian Institution wanted to hire him as a consultant for their maritime archaeology program. They had been impressed not just by his success in locating the Mississippi Belle, but by his methodical approach to researching the historical context that had led him to the discovery. What you've accomplished here represents exactly the kind of interdisciplinary thinking we're trying to encourage, Dr. Marcus Chen, the Smithsonian's Director of Maritime Studies, explained during a video call. You combined historical research, geological analysis, and intuitive reasoning to solve a puzzle that had stumped professional researchers for decades. The idea of working for one of the world's most prestigious research institutions was thrilling and terrifying. Thomas had never considered himself an academic, had never imagined that his combination of desperation and determination might translate into a legitimate career in historical discovery. But as he stood at the edge of the excavation site on what would be the final day of the recovery operation, watching Eleanor's team carefully removing the last artifacts from Captain Blackwood's treasure ship, Thomas felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with purpose. He had proven that the patterns he saw in historical documents and local folklore were more than wishful thinking. He had demonstrated that sometimes the difference between success and failure wasn't intelligence or education or connections, but simply the willingness to risk everything on an idea that nobody else was crazy enough to pursue. The Mississippi Belle sat in its muddy cradle, finally empty of the secrets it had guarded for more than 150 years. But Thomas understood that this ending was also a beginning, the start of a new chapter in his life that would be defined not by the failures that had driven him to desperation, but by the success that had emerged from his willingness to bet everything on an impossible dream. As the sun set over Millbrook County on that final day of excavation, Thomas Hartwell stood as a transformed man. The broke farmer who had been mocked for buying worthless swampland had become the discoverer of one of America's greatest treasure hoards. But more importantly, he had become living proof that sometimes the most ridiculous ideas turn out to be the most valuable ones, and that sometimes the difference between wisdom and foolishness is nothing more than the final outcome. The treasure was secured, the ship was documented, and the story was complete. But for Thomas Hartwell, the real adventure was just beginning. 5 years later, Thomas Hartwell stood on the covered porch of his restored farmhouse, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the fields that his grandfather had first plowed nearly a century ago. The land looked different now, not just because of the prosperity that the Mississippi Belle's treasure had brought, but because Thomas saw it through different eyes. Where once he had seen only the weight of legacy and the burden of expectations, he now saw possibility and potential waiting to be discovered. The farmhouse itself bore little resemblance to the place Margaret had fled 5 years earlier. The sagging porch had been rebuilt with materials that honored the original design while incorporating modern conveniences. The kitchen where Thomas had once sat, surrounded by unpaid bills, now featured state-of-the-art appliances and a breakfast nook where his daughter, Sarah, did her homework each morning before school. The walls that had once seemed to close in with the pressure of financial ruin now displayed framed photographs documenting his discoveries and archaeological consultations from around the world. "Dad, you're going to be late for your interview if you don't leave soon," Sarah called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a 13-year-old who had inherited her mother's practical nature and her father's stubborn determination. Thomas smiled, checking his watch. The interview was with National Geographic, part of a documentary series about amateur archaeologists who had made significant historical discoveries. It was the kind of attention he had never sought, but had learned to accept as part of his new identity as the man who had proven that sometimes the most unlikely theories turned out to be correct. As he walked to his truck, a new model, but still a practical farm vehicle rather than the luxury car that wealth might have justified, Thomas reflected on how completely his life had changed since that desperate morning when he had signed the contract to buy what everyone called worthless swampland. The treasure itself had been valued at $187 million after extensive appraisal and authentication. Thomas had kept his promise to himself, using the first proceeds to pay off the farm debt and establish college funds for Sarah and the son who had been born 2 years after Margaret's return home. The rest had been invested in a foundation dedicated to supporting historical research and archaeological education, with Thomas serving as its active director. The Hartwell Foundation for Historical Discovery had already funded 17 archaeological projects across the United States, from Native American settlement sites in the Southwest to colonial shipwrecks along the Atlantic coast. Thomas had personally participated in 12 of those excavations, developing a reputation for the kind of intuitive pattern recognition that had led him to the Mississippi Belle. But perhaps more satisfying than the professional recognition was the transformation in his relationships with the people of Millbrook County. Dale Pritchard had never quite apologized for his years of mockery, but he had become a grudging supporter of Thomas's work, even donating land for one of the foundation's research projects. The coffee shop conversations that had once centered on Thomas's failures now featured speculation about his next discovery and pride in having a genuine celebrity among their neighbors. The most profound change, however, was in his marriage. Margaret had returned home 6 months after the treasure discovery, not because of the money, though the financial security certainly removed one source of stress, but because she had recognized the man who had risked everything on an impossible theory was the same man she had fallen in love with 20 years earlier. The years of failure had obscured that essential quality, but they hadn't destroyed it. "Your success wasn't just about finding the treasure," she had told him during one of their evening walks around the property. "It was about proving that you still had the courage to trust your instincts even when everyone else thought you were crazy. That's the man I married, and that's the man I want to grow old with." As Thomas drove toward the television studio in Indianapolis, he passed the site where Blackwater Marsh had once spread like a dark secret across the landscape. The area was now home to the Captain Jeremiah Blackwood Maritime Heritage Center, a world-class museum and research facility that attracted visitors from around the globe. The Mississippi Belle itself, painstakingly restored and permanently displayed in a climate-controlled pavilion, served as the centerpiece of exhibits that told the story of pre-Civil War commerce and the networks of people who had tried to preserve wealth during one of America's most turbulent periods.
Eleanor Sage, now the museum's chief curator, had become not just a colleague, but a close friend whose academic expertise had been crucial in establishing the historical context that made Thomas's discovery significant beyond its monetary value. Under her direction, the Research Center had published 3 books and dozens of scholarly articles about Captain Blackwood's cargo and its implications for understanding the economic foundations of the Civil War. The National Geographic interview went smoothly, with Thomas sharing the story of his discovery for what felt like the 1,000th time. But he never tired of telling it, because each retelling reinforced the lesson that had changed his life. Sometimes, the difference between wisdom and foolishness was simply a matter of being right about something that seemed impossible. After the interview, Thomas drove to the university where he was scheduled to deliver a guest lecture to graduate students in the archaeology department. It was a responsibility he had taken on reluctantly at first, uncomfortable with the idea of teaching subjects he had learned through intuition and desperation rather than formal study. But he had discovered that his unconventional background actually enhanced his ability to help students think outside the boundaries of traditional academic approaches. "The most important thing I can tell you," Thomas said to the assembled students, "is that the best discoveries often come from paying attention to the things that everyone else dismisses as unimportant. The folklore that seems like nonsense, the historical accounts that don't fit conventional narratives, the patterns that appear meaningless until you find the right context to interpret them." One student raised her hand. "But how do you tell the difference between a genuine insight and wishful thinking? How do you know when to trust your instincts and when to listen to the experts who say you're wrong?" Thomas smiled, remembering his own struggles with that exact question. "You don't know. That's what makes it both terrifying and exhilarating. But if you only pursue the discoveries that experts approve of in advance, you're probably not going to discover anything that changes the way people think about the world." After the lecture, Thomas drove home through the countryside that had shaped his understanding of landscape and history. The late afternoon light cast everything in warm gold, and he could see the silhouettes of other farms where families were carrying on traditions that stretched back generations.
Some of those families were struggling with the same pressures that had nearly destroyed his own life 5 years earlier. And Thomas had quietly used his foundation to provide emergency assistance to several neighbors facing foreclosure. The foundation's work extended far beyond Millbrook County, but Thomas had never forgotten that his success had grown from local soil and local relationships. The treasure that had changed his life had been hidden in land that his own community had dismissed as worthless, and he felt a responsibility to ensure that the benefits of his discovery continued to enrich the place where it had happened. As he pulled into his driveway, Thomas saw Margaret and Sarah working in the garden that had become Margaret's passion project since her return. She was teaching their daughter the same lessons about patience and cultivation that Thomas's grandfather had passed down through the generations, creating continuity between the family's agricultural past and whatever future they would build together. "How did the interview go?" Margaret asked, looking up from the tomato plants she was staking for the season. "Fine. Same questions, same answers. But I think the documentary might actually help some other amateur researchers get the support they need for their own projects." Thomas had been surprised to discover how many people across the country were pursuing their own versions of his Mississippi Belle theory, following hunches and historical clues that professional researchers had overlooked or dismissed. His foundation regularly received letters from farmers, local historians, and amateur archaeologists who had ideas that sounded as crazy as his swampland purchase had seemed to everyone in Millbrook County. "Speaking of support," Margaret said with a smile, "Eleanor called while you were gone. The National Science Foundation approved the grant proposal for the Ohio River Survey project. You're going to get your chance to look for Captain Blackwood's other routes." Thomas felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that had become his signal that another discovery might be waiting. The Mississippi Belle had been just one vessel in what appeared to be a larger network of financial operations that had moved enormous wealth through the American interior during the 1850s. Thomas had developed theories about other vessels and other routes, hypotheses that were based on the same kind of pattern recognition that had led him to Blackwater Marsh.
But this time, he wouldn't be working alone as a desperate man with nothing left to lose. This time, he would have professional support, adequate funding, and the credibility that came from proven success. The amateur archaeologist who had been mocked for buying worthless swampland had become a respected researcher whose theories were taken seriously by institutions and experts who would have dismissed him completely 5 years earlier. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner in the kitchen that had once been the center of Thomas's despair, Sarah announced that she had decided to study archaeology in college, inspired by watching her father's work and the excitement of discovery that had transformed their lives. "I want to learn the scientific methods that Dad never had a chance to study," she said. "But I also want to learn how to see the patterns that other people miss, the way he does." Thomas stood before a wall-mounted display showing the Foundation's current projects: a search for Viking settlements in Newfoundland, an investigation into lost Spanish treasure ships off the coast of Florida, an excavation of Mayan trade routes in Guatemala, and 17 other ventures that would have seemed like impossible fantasies to the desperate farmer who had bought worthless swampland a decade ago. But success, Thomas had discovered, created its own form of pressure. Every project carried the weight of expectation, the assumption that because he had been right about the Mississippi Belle, his judgment about other historical mysteries would prove equally prescient. The Foundation's board of directors, comprised of respected academics and successful business people, looked to him for the kind of insights that couldn't be taught in universities or learned from textbooks. "Thomas, we need to discuss the situation in Romania," said Dr. Patricia Holbrook,
the Foundation's vice president and a maritime historian whose initial skepticism about Thomas's methods had gradually transformed into cautious respect. She entered his office carrying a thick folder that Thomas recognized as containing their most problematic current project. The Romania situation had begun 6 months earlier when a local farmer named Ion Popescu had contacted the Foundation with a theory that sounded remarkably similar to Thomas's original Mississippi Belle hypothesis. Popescu claimed that a medieval treasure convoy had been ambushed and lost in what was now agricultural land near the Carpathian Mountains, and he had assembled historical documents and local folklore to support his belief that the treasure remained buried in his fields. The parallels to Thomas's own story were uncanny. A desperate landowner facing financial ruin, a theory dismissed by local experts, and a willingness to risk everything on what appeared to be an impossible dream. The Foundation had approved funding for a preliminary survey, but the project had quickly become complicated by Romanian government officials who claimed jurisdiction over any historical artifacts discovered on national soil. "What's the latest development?" Thomas asked, though he could guess from Patricia's expression that the news wasn't encouraging. "Popescu's been arrested," Patricia said grimly. "The authorities are claiming he was conducting illegal excavations without proper permits. Our survey team has been ordered to cease operations, and there are suggestions that the Romanian government might pursue criminal charges against the Foundation for supporting unauthorized archaeological activities." Thomas felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, the same sensation he had experienced during his darkest days of debt and uncertainty. The Foundation's mission was to support exactly the kind of intuitive research that had led to his own success. But operating in foreign countries meant navigating legal and political complexities that could destroy the organization's reputation and effectiveness. "What are our legal options?" "Limited," Patricia admitted. "Romanian law gives the government broad authority over archaeological activities, and our lawyers think we'd have difficulty proving that Popescu's preliminary excavations fell within acceptable research parameters." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Thomas's office door. His assistant, Jennifer Walsh, the same graduate student who had discovered the first timber of the Mississippi Belle and had subsequently become the Foundation's Director of Field Operations, entered with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Thomas, I just got off the phone with Professor Martinez in Mexico City. You need to hear this." Professor Eduardo Martinez was leading the Foundation's investigation into Aztec trade routes, a project that had been proceeding slowly but methodically for the past 2 years. Unlike the Romania situation, the Mexico project had the full support of local authorities and was being conducted in partnership with the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. "They found something," Jennifer continued, her voice tight with the kind of controlled enthusiasm that Thomas had learned to recognize as a sign of significant discovery. Not treasure exactly, but documents, codices that appeared to describe Spanish colonial financial operations that nobody knew existed. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Throughout the Foundation's work, he had learned that the most valuable discoveries weren't always gold and silver. Sometimes they were information that reshaped understanding of historical events and human behavior. What kind of financial operations? According to Martinez's preliminary translation,
The Spanish colonial administration was operating a secret banking system that moved enormous amounts of wealth between Mexico and Europe during the 17th century. The codices describe routes, procedures, and security measures that suggest the scale of this operation was far larger than anyone had imagined. Patricia leaned forward in her chair. Are we talking about another treasure situation or historical documentation? Both, Jennifer replied. The codices include detailed maps showing the locations of emergency caches, places where treasure convoys could hide their cargo if they encountered threats during transport. Martinez thinks some of these caches might still be intact. Thomas walked to his office window, looking out over the grounds of the research center that had been built where Blackwater Marsh once spread its dark waters. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the transformation of his own life, but it also reminded him of the responsibility that came with success. Every decision the foundation made affected not just the researchers they supported, but the communities where their work took place. Jennifer, I want you to coordinate with Martinez to ensure that any treasure discoveries are handled properly with Mexican authorities from the beginning. I don't want a repeat of the Romania situation. Already done, Jennifer replied. Martinez has been working closely with the Instituto Nacional de Antropología e Historia since day one. If we find anything significant, it'll be a legitimate joint venture with full government support. The Mexico project represented the kind of careful, methodical approach that Thomas had learned was essential for the foundation's long-term credibility. But it also highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of his new role, balancing the instinctive risk-taking that had led to his initial success with the institutional responsibility that came with managing a large organization. After Patricia and Jennifer left his office, Thomas spent the morning reviewing reports from the Foundation's other active projects. The variety was staggering. A search for Civil War gold in Virginia, an investigation into Norse artifacts in Minnesota, a survey of Spanish shipwrecks in the Caribbean, and a dozen other ventures that represented the dreams and theories of amateur researchers who had been inspired by his own success. Each project file contained the same elements that had characterized his Mississippi Belle research: historical documents that professional archaeologists had overlooked, local folklore that might contain kernels of truth, and passionate advocates who were willing to risk their credibility on theories that seemed impossible to conventional thinking. But Thomas had also learned that for every Mississippi Belle, there were a dozen theories that led nowhere. The Foundation's success rate was approximately 15%. Meaning that 85% of their projects failed to produce significant discoveries. That ratio was actually considered excellent in the archaeological community, but it meant that Thomas regularly had to deliver disappointing news to people who had invested their hopes and dreams in ideas that proved to be incorrect. The most difficult conversation of that type had occurred 3 years ago, when the Foundation had spent 18 months and nearly $2 million investigating a theory about lost Confederate gold in the mountains of North Carolina during the final days of the Civil War. The researcher, a retired history teacher named William Crawford, had assembled compelling evidence that a Confederate treasury convoy had buried a fortune in gold coins somewhere in the Pisgah National Forest during the final days of the Civil War. Crawford's research had been meticulous, his historical documentation impressive, and his passion undeniable. But after extensive excavation and survey work, the Foundation's team had found nothing but empty holes and broken dreams. Crawford had taken the failure personally, convinced that they had simply been looking in the wrong locations or using inadequate methods. The experience had taught Thomas that success created not just opportunities, but obligations.
obligations to the people who look to him for guidance, to the communities affected by the Foundation's work, and to the historical truth that transcended individual desires for wealth and recognition.
His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of his son, Michael Hartwell, Jr., who had recently graduated from college with degrees in both archaeology and business administration. At 23, Michael possessed the academic training that Thomas had never received, combined with an intuitive understanding of the pattern recognition skills that had made his father successful. "Dad, I've been thinking about the Romania situation," Michael said, settling into one of the chairs facing Thomas's desk. "What if we approached it differently?" "What kind of different approach?" "Instead of trying to work around the Romanian government, what if we worked with them? What if we offered to fund a proper archaeological survey conducted entirely by Romanian institutions, with the Foundation serving as a silent partner that provides financial support without claiming any rights to discoveries?" It was, Thomas realized, exactly the kind of creative thinking that the Foundation needed. Michael's suggestion would protect Ion Popescu from criminal charges while allowing the research to proceed under legitimate academic auspices. It would also establish a model for future international projects that could avoid the legal and political complications that had plagued their current efforts. "That's brilliant," Thomas said, "but it would also mean giving up any claim to whatever Popescu might find." Michael shrugged. "The Foundation's mission is to support historical discovery, not to acquire treasure. If Popescu's theory is correct and the Romanian team finds something significant, we'll have accomplished our goal even if we don't profit financially." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent phone call from Eleanor Sage, who was leading the Foundation's newest and most ambitious project, a comprehensive survey of Civil War-era financial operations throughout the Mississippi River Valley. Eleanor's team was investigating the possibility that Captain Blackwood's network had been much larger than originally believed, with multiple vessels and routes that had moved enormous amounts of wealth during the turbulent years leading up to and during the Civil War. "Thomas, you need to get down here immediately." Eleanor's voice carried an urgency that made Thomas's pulse quicken. Eleanor was calling from a site near Memphis, where her team had been excavating what appeared to be a lost river port that had served as a hub for antebellum financial operations. The discovery had been prompted by local folklore about money boats that had once traveled secret routes along the Mississippi's tributaries, carrying wealth for wealthy families who were preparing for the possibility of civil conflict. Thomas and Michael drove to Memphis that afternoon, making the journey in Thomas's truck while discussing the implications of Eleanor's discovery. If Blackwood's network had been larger than originally believed, it might explain the enormous value of the cargo they had found aboard the Mississippi Belle. It might also suggest that other vessels with similar cargoes remained hidden in the river system, waiting for discovery by researchers who understood the patterns that had guided Blackwood's operations. They arrived at the excavation site just as the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across what had once been a bustling river port, but was now nothing more than a collection of foundation stones and rotting timber hidden beneath decades of vegetation growth. Eleanor's team had been working methodically to expose and document the site's layout, revealing a complex of buildings that suggested much more sophisticated operations than simple cargo loading and unloading. "Look at this," Eleanor said, leading them to a partially excavated building that appeared to have served as some kind of counting house or banking facility. "We've found account ledgers."
shipping manifests and correspondence that documents financial operations involving millions of dollars, 1850s dollars, which would be worth hundreds of millions today. The documents that Eleanor's team had recovered painted a picture of financial operations that dwarfed even the impressive cargo of the Mississippi Belle. Wealthy families throughout the South and Midwest had been systematically converting their assets to portable form and moving them through Blackwood's network to secure locations in northern cities and European banks. They knew the war was coming, Eleanor explained, as they examined the preserved documents. The smart money was getting out of the region before the conflict destroyed the old economic order. Blackwood wasn't just running treasure, he was facilitating one of the largest wealth preservation operations in American history. But the most stunning discovery came when Eleanor led them to a section of the site where her team had uncovered what appeared to be a private vault built into the riverbank itself. The vault had been sealed with the same kind of tar and canvas techniques that Captain Blackwood had used to protect his cargo, suggesting that it had been designed to preserve whatever was stored inside for extended periods of time. "We haven't opened it yet," Eleanor said. "We wanted to wait for you to arrive before we breached the seal." Thomas felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that had characterized every significant moment of his archaeological career. The vault might contain treasure that would dwarf even the Mississippi Belle discovery. It might contain historical documents that would revolutionize understanding of pre-Civil War America. Or it might be empty. Another reminder that not every promising lead resulted in extraordinary discoveries. As Eleanor's team carefully removed the vault's sealing materials, Thomas reflected on how much his relationship with discovery had changed over the past decade. The desperate farmer who had bought Swampland as a last resort was driven by financial necessity and personal desperation. The successful foundation director, who now stood beside professionally equipped archaeological teams, was motivated by curiosity and the desire to advance historical understanding. But the essential element remained the same: the willingness to believe that impossible theories might contain kernels of truth, and that sometimes the most unlikely places held the most extraordinary secrets. The vault, when finally opened, contained neither gold nor silver nor precious gems. Instead, it held something far more valuable from a historical perspective: the personal archives of Captain Jeremiah Blackwood himself, including his private correspondence, detailed maps of his transportation network, and financial records that documented every aspect of his operations from 1855 until his disappearance in 1859. "My God," Eleanor whispered as she examined the documents with professional reverence. "This is like finding the Rosetta Stone of pre-Civil War financial operations. These papers document everything: routes, contacts, procedures, security measures, even the political intelligence that guided Blackwood's decisions about when and where to move particular cargoes." Thomas understood immediately that they had discovered something that transcended mere treasure hunting. The Blackwood archives represented a window into a hidden aspect of American history: the complex financial networks that had allowed wealthy individuals and institutions to preserve their assets during one of the nation's most turbulent periods. But the archives also contained information that suggested the Foundation's work had barely scratched the surface of what remained to be discovered.
Blackwood's records indicated that at least 7 other vessels in his network had been lost during the years leading up to the Civil War, each carrying cargoes that rivaled or exceeded the value of the Mississippi Belle. According to these manifests, Michael said, studying one of Blackwood's ledgers with the intensity he had inherited from his father, there are potentially 6 more treasure ships waiting to be found along various tributaries of the Mississippi River system. Eleanor nodded. And these maps show exact routes and emergency procedures that Blackwood used when his vessels encountered danger. If we can correlate this information with geological surveys and historical water level data, we might be able to identify specific locations where other ships went down.
As the sun set over the excavation site, Thomas realized that the discovery of Blackwood's archives marked not the conclusion of his archaeological career, but the beginning of its most ambitious phase. The Foundation now possessed information that could guide treasure hunting operations for decades to come, with the potential for discoveries that would make the Mississippi Belle seem like a minor find. But he also understood that success on this scale would bring scrutiny and challenges that the Foundation had never faced. Government agencies would want to claim jurisdiction over discoveries made on public lands. International treasure hunting organizations would seek partnerships or attempt to acquire the Blackwood archives through legal or illegal means. Academic institutions would demand access to information that could reshape multiple fields of historical study. That evening, as Thomas, Michael, and Eleanor sat in a Memphis hotel planning their next steps, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility that came with possessing information that could change lives and careers throughout the archaeological community. "We need to be extremely careful about how we proceed," he said. "This information is going to make the Foundation a target for every treasure hunter, government agency, and academic institution in the world. We need to develop protocols for sharing our discoveries while protecting our ability to continue our work." Michael had been studying the legal implications of their situation. "Dad, I think we need to consider establishing partnerships with major universities and government agencies from the beginning. If we try to go it alone, we're going to face the same kinds of problems we've had in Romania and other international projects." Eleanor agreed. "The academic community is going to want access to these archives regardless of whether we cooperate voluntarily. It's better to establish collaborative relationships now than to have information forced from us through legal challenges later." Over the following months, the Foundation negotiated agreements with the Smithsonian Institution, the National Geographic Society, and 3 major universities to share access to the Blackwood archives in exchange for support and legitimacy for future excavation projects. The arrangements were complex and sometimes contentious, but they provided the Foundation with resources and credibility that would have been impossible to achieve independently. The first joint expedition, launched 8 months after the discovery of the archives, targeted a tributary of the Tennessee River, where Blackwood's records indicated that a vessel called the River Queen had been lost in 1858 while carrying what the captain described as the personal treasury of a prominent Southern family preparing for uncertain times. The expedition was a model of archaeological best practices, with teams from multiple institutions working together under protocols that ensured proper documentation and preservation of any discoveries. The media attention was intense, but carefully managed, with regular updates that built public interest while protecting the integrity of the research process. When the River Queen was finally located and excavated, its cargo proved to be even more spectacular than the Mississippi Belle's treasure. The vessel contained not just gold and silver, but also rare artwork, historical documents, and personal artifacts that provided unprecedented insights into the lives of America's wealthiest families during the antebellum period.
But perhaps more importantly, the successful collaboration demonstrated that the foundation could work effectively with established institutions while maintaining its mission of supporting unconventional research and amateur archaeologists. The model that emerged from the River Queen project became the template for all subsequent foundation ventures, balancing the need for professional credibility with the innovative thinking that had made Thomas's original discovery possible. As Thomas stood on the deck of the research vessel that had become the Foundation's floating headquarters, watching teams of archaeologists carefully documenting artifacts that had been hidden beneath the waters for more than 160 years, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from desperate farmer to respected archaeological leader. The success was gratifying, but it was the process of discovery itself that continued to drive him. The thrill of following historical clues to their logical conclusions, the satisfaction of proving that dismissed theories sometimes contained profound truths, and the knowledge that his work was inspiring other amateur researchers to trust their instincts and pursue their own impossible dreams.
The Foundation had received more than 3,000 letters from people around the world who believed they had identified lost treasures, hidden artifacts, or historical mysteries waiting to be solved. Most of these theories would prove incorrect, but Thomas knew from experience that among the hopeful amateurs and passionate researchers were a few individuals whose insights would lead to discoveries that would amaze the world. His job was to identify those rare visionaries and provide them with the support they needed to transform their impossible dreams into extraordinary realities. It was, he had learned, the most rewarding work he could imagine, and it all traced back to that desperate morning when he had decided to bet everything on a piece of worthless swampland that everyone else had dismissed as impossible to develop. The lesson had never changed. Sometimes the most ridiculous ideas turned out to be the most valuable insights, and sometimes the difference between wisdom and foolishness was simply a matter of being right about something that seemed impossible to everyone else. Thomas Hartwell had built a career on that principle, and he intended to spend the rest of his life proving that there were still impossible treasures waiting for people brave enough to look for them in the most unlikely places. If this incredible journey from failure to fortune inspired you, please like this video and subscribe for more amazing stories of ordinary people who achieved the impossible.